We want to welcome you. First, we want to say, if we were playing bingo, you could all shout out bingo right now because you won the big prize. You picked the right panel to be on. We hope you leave here educated, but if you're not educated, hopefully you'll be somewhat entertained by the time you leave. My name is Chris Mallette. I'm with the Chicago Violence Reduction Strategy and the National Network for Safe Communities. We're the satellite out in Chicago. We're here to talk about sustaining success, new thinking on management and accountability in the National Network for Safe Communities work. So with us today on our panel, we have Trisha Stein from the city of Detroit, Vaughn Crandall from the California Partnership for Safe Communities, and Louisa Aviles from the National Network for Safe Communities. It's a privilege that you guys are here. We thank you for showing up, all kidding aside. And I will tell you before we get going, I will absolutely sound like the most intelligent guy up here because I'm a genius, all right? Usually I let that ruminate a little bit. We don't have time for that in this panel, though. But I tell people I'm a genius for 3 reasons, the same 3 reasons that make me a great football coach. I know what I don't know. I'm humble enough to admit it, although I will admit somewhat stubborn to get to that point of humility, but ultimately humble enough to admit what I don't know, and I'm smart enough to surround myself with the people who know it. These are some of those folks, as well as some of you in the audience. So what you see up here, at least the Chicago stuff, is a compilation of 8 to 10 years of just picking everybody's brains from around the country and extracting as much as I can extract to try to make us better. So we're here to talk about how do we sustain success when we get success. You know, we'll see oftentimes people will declare success, be it a mayor or a police chief or a community partner. But once you start to see some movement and success, how do you keep that? How do you keep that thing going? How do you keep the excitement going? How do we not jump to the next thing when the big next media story hits? Whether it's something horrific that happens in the community or a change in the political climate in your particular city or jurisdiction. How do you keep this thing going? Some of the challenges we look at sustainability for us, really to a large extent, it's ownership. Getting your city to own the strategy. You know, we say the violence reduction strategy in Chicago because we want to be very clear. It's not a program. It's not a initiative or anything like that per se, because it's not something that's going to go away. It's a strategy. We take the best stuff that the coppers have been doing for over 100 years. We take the best stuff that community folks have been doing, that street outreach people have been doing. And we take all that and we figure out how do we integrate all this into break down all those different silos, build those bridges, and get a strategy that's going to be something that's going to last and outlast, hopefully, all of us in our positions. Hopefully outlast the police chief or commissioner or superintendent, whatever you guys call them, wherever you are in the nation. Outlast mayors, outlast all types of folks, outlast political runs. So part of that is successfully navigating those shifting political landscapes, arguments that pertain to scope and scale. We all are encountering that. You know, if you have a little success in one area, go citywide, go bigger. You know, why can't you do more? Where's the outreach? And you heard some of the comments today. You know, you want to go bigger, but you don't want to fund bigger. You know, some of the commentary that we are constantly confronted with in this work is, how can we raise millions and millions of dollars for campaigns seemingly overnight, but we can't find scraps to give to the most pressing problems that are confronting our cities at times? And it's something that's endemic to all of us. You know, it's not just one particular city. We all have it in different capacities. So how do we, lastly, develop those tangible processes? So hopefully, listening to the panel here, you'll see there's some things that you can actually put in place that you can actually be very intentional so you don't have to go through the mistakes, and you can avoid the mistakes that Vaughn and Trisha and I and Louisa have had to actually go through. So we're trying to save you some of our pain. So you don't have to deal with that. And some of it you're just going to have to deal with. But the goal of the session at the end of all of this is trying to help develop a roadmap to achieve a robust project management for this work. And something that obviously, like the title says, will be sustainable. So I wasn't planning on it on the outset as the moderator. I was trying to be a very good and gracious host. I'm the baby of 5. So you can see that in my personality a little bit, right? I got to scrap for everything. You can lick the food and put it in the fridge. I'm going to eat it. I don't care. It's how I survive. I'm the baby. So for you older siblings, all the people that didn't laugh at that joke, they're the eldest. They're the eldest. All the people that are getting really disgruntled, they're the middle children. But anyhow, here we go. So the city of Chicago, what we actually do. So we're going to kind of walk you through our particular cities in the next about 30 minutes. And then we're just going to dive right into some questions for the panel. And we're going to try to save the last 15, 20 minutes or so for you to ask questions. So if I talk fast, if something's pressing, just raise your hand, blurt it out, and I'll try to address it as we go through. So the first thing, this is an audit. This is a gang audit. So one of the things we break it into, we have 3 partners in the violence reduction strategy in Chicago, which is Operation Ceasefire for Chicago. So our 3 main pillars of partnership, we have law enforcement partners, we have community partners, and then we have outreach and support partners. The community partners, we call them the community moral voice, folks that speak at call-ins, folks that come to custom notifications with us, whatever the case may be. But it's those community voices that come with us and partner with us. But what we do, the first thing is, if you look at, really you could break it down into 4 areas when we're combating and how do we get after group-involved violence. Number 1 is the gang audit. So we look at sitting down with law enforcement and really mapping out where are all the factions, who's where. The days of these guys, this district is the gangster disciples. It's not. There's 17 different factions of gangster disciples. Some of them allied, some of them beefing, some of them make money one way, some of them make money another way. You don't know what the interactions are going to be that are going to drive violence, but it's important to know exactly who it is you're working with. So the first thing is a gang audit, really kind of getting down to the nitty-gritty of who's who, where are they, how are they, who they allied with, who are they beefing with, how do they make their money, how organized are they, what do their numbers look like, how violent are they. And that's very important. It's kind of the foundation of everything that we do. Following the audit, the next thing would be a shooting review. Now this is something that we grafted from Oakland and Vaughn. I'll tell you, I'm going to brag that we're the best, but I'll also footnote things and let you know where we got the ideas from. This came directly from Oakland. We went out to Oakland about a year or so ago and sat with the California Partnership, and we looked at how they do their shooting reviews. And it's basically a scorecard. So once you have the audit, you know where everybody is, you know who they are, you know how those borders and those dynamics change with the factions. The next step is who's causing the violence. So in this first district, you see there's 29 gang factions in this district. This is the most violent district in Chicago, traditionally, historically, and during the last 2 years. On the west side of Chicago, 29 separate factions. You have 5 that are driving the violence. Now, those numbers there, you look at, so the audit, it really breaks down. You look at, you spend every week, you sit down in a room with law enforcement partners. We haven't got to the community side of it. I think, Vaughn, you're going to touch on that? Yes. All right, I'll let Vaughn touch on that. But from the law enforcement audit or shooting review, you look at every single shooting and you literally go through every shooting that happened during the course of a week. And you say, was this shooting incident gang related or not? Well, what does that mean? Well, who is involved? We know who the victim is, right? But do we know who's the suspected shooter? And then you start to look and see, well, you get a point for each incident. So if I'm involved in an incident and 7 of my guys get shot, you don't give me 8 points. I get 1 point. But what we'll do is we'll throw in the parentheses there, what else happened there? So that last column in red gives you the total number of victims. So you get the idea, you get a size of, or a sense of who's the most violent factions out there, who's running and gunning, who's shooting, who's hot right now. And what you see, those 29 factions, the vast majority of those factions have 1 to 3 shooting incidents in the last 8 months. So that begs the question, are we playing whack-a-mole here? Are we chasing people that, yes, we need to solve the crime and get after the violence, but if you're really trying to press down for what's happening at that moment in time, these are the guys that you got to go after. So we changed that just to faction A through F, that type of stuff. And it changes over time. But you get an idea. Look at that top guy, the top faction there, 23 incidents of shooting with 32 victims in a 6-month span. I think that's who your focused deterrence should probably be against right now. So when you have a police chief or a district commander who says, we're going to focus on faction Q, and they're not even on the map, you know, you argue. That's when you stand up and you start to argue. And I mean, I'm getting older, so I don't throw as many punches, obviously, as I used to when I was younger. But you selectively figure out when to throw a punch. What it actually begins to look like is now you can see those factions. So if you put every faction on that map, the vast majority of them would be under that green line, if you could see the green line. I put it in black. It was actually easier than being on the white background. But so why are we chasing those guys? Yes, we have to solve those crimes, but you're trying to impact some serious levels of violence. Why are you chasing all those other guys? And that really begins another conversation, because sometimes you'll sit and your federal partners may have a huge federal case against someone who doesn't even hit the Richter scale on your violence map. And that angers your local law enforcement, because they're saying, you know, why are we bothering to do this if we're not getting the support? So this is actually a way to get everybody in the room and give everybody some visuals on who do we need to go after and how. Then you get to the point where the one thing that law enforcement hasn't really historically kept data on is what's group involved versus non-group involved. You know, you say gang related, is it gang related? Well, is it? You know, if we have a shooting, we can actually say, no, that was a robbery or that was a domestic. So yes, it counts as a shooting, but it's not going to count. And that's where we have, you can't really see it, but we have blue for non-group involved and red for group involved. And you can see when we started, you know, we're registering close to 30 shootings in a week and about 5 homicides in one of our 22 districts in the city of Chicago. And then we get it down. You can see after about 5 or 6 weeks of doing this, we're hovering around 5 now every single week. We had we got 2 zeros in there, you know. In Chicago, that's a holiday for us, you know. We haven't figured out what to name it yet, but used to be a day without a shooting in the district was a holiday. Now you get a whole week without a shooting, you know. So it's how do you get there? A large part of it, and I didn't put those up for obvious reasons and sensitivity of information, but it's deliverables. When you do the shooting review, you have people in there and you're looking at who's accountable for what. So the boss sits at the table and says, what's gang investigations doing? This is the group we're focusing on. Who's out there? What do you know about that? What missions are you doing? What's narcotics doing? Okay, what's troubled buildings doing? Can we get the real estate that they occupy? You know, what are all the different people in the law enforcement community doing? What's parole doing? Can we do some parole compliance checks on these guys we know are hot and we know are carrying guns right now? And then conversely, Vaughn will get into, there's a community review that happens as well. And you have community partners and you review the shootings and try to be just as aggressive, if not more aggressive from the community standpoint, going after guys as you are with law enforcement. So then you get into who are your key conflicts. And lo and behold, when you look at those key conflicts, E and D, E and F, F and A, it's those same 5 groups that you saw on the chart at the top. So it becomes a very objective way. There's no profiling here. We're looking at who is driving your gun violence in your city and in your district. And it's very objective. So it takes, and I will be honest with you, some of the challenges, officer gets shot. I don't care what faction is driving it. When an officer gets shot, that faction just moved to the top of the list. You know, that's real. So, but this gives you a very subjective way. And then you see when's our next call-in going to be, the group meeting with the gang members. So we know when our next call-in is, who's your focused deterrence group? And then you have to declare who's your group, which faction is it going to be. You can see there some of our problems. Faction A, who's number 2 on the overall list, number 1 right now, isn't even from the district. So how do we have a call-in in the district, but now we know who the other district will have? And then it gets to custom notification. So once you go from, and I'm going to wrap this up in about 3 minutes here, so bear with me. Once you go from the audit, we know who's out there, who's who. Then we go to the shooting review, who's driving what, and how are they driving it. Then we go to, okay, now we've identified those particular individual factions. Who are the individuals that we need to talk to? Those are what we call custom notifications, door-to-door visits. So now we'll go door-to-door. We do about 1,000 of them a year in Chicago. We do this citywide. So we'll go door to door and meet with those individuals. And there's 10 different reasons to do them. I'm not going to get into them now. I will later in the Q&A if you're interested. But you can see with the custom notifications, you look at the attempts. Following the attempts, the blue column is overall citywide. After we do the custom, how many of those guys commit a violent offense? You know, so it's about 20% of the guys are going to commit a violent offense after. Because if the message is stop shooting people, then how do you measure that message, right? We say, okay, in Chicago, our violence is very tragic, but it's not very random. Most of our offenders are victims and vice versa. You know, it's driven a little bit differently in our city. Not so differently, but sometimes you could argue a little differently. But very few guys, less than 20% are committing a violent offense. About 10% become victims after we talk to them door to door. And then we have about 25, 30% reaching out for help. And the offer for help, that's their family and their friends as well. The CPRVV, the reason I put that there, that's a particular, we borrowed this from Chattanooga, Tennessee. And Dr. Paul Smith, who you've seen running around, he's with the National Network now. They picked him up in free agency and pulled him over here to New York. But Paul introduced us to, right after a guy's gotten shot, go talk to him. And who are the partners that you bring? We have Maria Pike in the audience with us now. She's one of the moms that goes out with us. So we'll go out with the moms. We don't wear vests. We're with law enforcement. We do this together. I have to make that point. We go law enforcement, community, and outreach and support all together. If we don't have all three partners, it's not our stuff. It's great police work. It's great street outreach, it's great community outreach, but it's not our stuff. But there's some magic with when we do this, especially after someone's been a victim of violence. I think it's the moms, to be honest with you. I love going out with the moms. The moms, think about this. Moms can do anything that they want to do. They could hit a guy, they could hug a guy, they could pray over a guy, it doesn't matter. No one's filing a complaint with the ACLU against the mom who came to my house and made me feel threatened. It's not going to happen. But it's amazing. Our moms talk to them about the reality of this thing, the aftermath, if you will, what this is actually doing. So you get out of the moment. And then the call-ins. We have the call-ins. We've done 82 call-ins in 6 years. We do them citywide. We've done them in about 14 of our most violent districts. We have 22 districts in Chicago. And you can see of the attendees, not many guys are becoming shooting victims, engaged in violent offenses, and over half of them have reached out for help. And then in the last 2 or 3 years, we're up to like 90%. The day we released the Laquan McDonald video, we had a call-in. I got called into a bunch of offices in the police department with folks saying, we can't do the call-in, this is going to be a revolution, it's going to go nuts. And I said, I'll be damned if I'm going to run the white flag up the pole here. This is precisely why we have to do a call-in. This is accountability. We're talking group accountability. It applies to everybody. We did the call-in that night. Those guys were the angriest guys I've ever seen. I've done all 82 of the call-ins. Angriest bunch that ever walked in the door. 90% of them reached out for help at the end of the night. Hung around, wouldn't leave, wanted to talk to the superintendent at the time. When you get the right people, it makes a very big difference. And then afterwards, what do they teach you when you're a kid, learning how to take a shower and wash your hair, right? Lather, rinse, repeat. Here you go again. We get right back into, we check the audit, revise your audit. Okay, it is what it is. Somebody new in, somebody dropped out, and then get back to the scorecard. And then you can see how things shift on the scorecard, and then you start over again tracking. So you're not stuck with one group because a particular chief or commander might have a beef against a guy or a faction or something that happened in the past. We make sure that we stay as objective as possible with this.
Cool. Thanks, Chris. Hello, everyone. Trisha Stein from the City of Detroit. Welcome. We run very similar programs, Chicago and Detroit. We've come for a peer exchange a couple of times to Chicago, and just as Chris said, a lot of times my first question that I ask when we do a peer exchange is, what were your lessons learned? Because I want to hear from your mistakes before I want to hear from your successes, because we'll learn a lot more from mistakes and try not to make the same ones. So just to do a little framing of Detroit, our estimate of population just came out last month, and so we're just under 700,000 is what they're predicting. Of course, the mayor desperately wants that to go up, and we're doing all sorts of things to make that up. We've got 143 square miles that we cover. That used to maintain about 2 million people, so if you could imagine the challenges to get your arms around that. I were in the planning department for a little while in the city, and just to get your arms around having just a fraction of the population, but still have to service those square miles, it has huge complications for public safety, for transportation, for basic needs. So just to frame it with the challenges, and of course, I'm sure you've heard about us lately, and we've come out of the largest municipal bankruptcy in the history of the country. So we're working on it. We're working on getting capacity. We have new leadership both in our police chief and our mayor, and they are extremely focused on ceasefire. So I'm going to explain that here in 1 minute. Some days we wish they weren't so focused on us, but it's a reality. They're brothers from another mother, we like to say all the time. They have an insatiable need for data and research. So if you take a look at two of the metrics that we are measured on, it's actually weekly that we put up at the mayor's cabinet meeting with 50 of his cabinet members as our non-fatal and our fatal shootings, and where do they trend year to date. We have been on a downward slide for the last few years. Of note, last year our non-fatal shootings went under 1,000 shootings, which is the lowest we've had in decades. We are trending down, but as you see, the violence is still off the charts from a population standpoint. Our homicide is 10 times the national average, and overall violent crime is 5 times the national average. So started ceasefire in 2013, just in 2 precincts. Those 2 precincts over on the east side, 5 and 9, they're the most violent precincts in the city at the time, trying to get our arms around it. This is before the chief really got really got control of the police department, and then the new mayor came in. And in 2015, we did a hard reset of ceasefire. I saw Amy. Amy's not in the room, is she? So Amy was one of the first people I saw last night, and she said, "I'll never forget that call we did 2 years ago." I said, "I'll never forget that call we did 2 years ago either." It was June 2015, and she said, "We were really fighting on the phone." I said, "Oh, we were really hardcore fighting on the phone because our mayor and chief were adamant about doing a hard reset." And so here we are a few years later, and I'm going to walk you through some of the metrics of how we are measured, how we adjust our program based on data. And a year ago today, almost directly to the day, we've branched out and expanded ceasefire to the 3 precincts on the west side. So we bookend the city. We're in 5 precincts. And overall, our 3 overall goals, key promises, is to reduce the shootings, provide job opportunities, and change community norms. There's a variety and a series of metrics that we are judged on and that we look at ourselves. And as Chris said, we have 3 buckets as well. We've got the enforcement partnership, which is local, state, and federal partners who all come together and try to plot strategy and do focused deterrence efforts. We've got our support and outreach that are street outreach workers, community and faith-based organizers, and then we've got our wraparound service providers. And in all areas of these 3, on the last 2 years, we have tried to increase capacity every step of the way and look for service gaps, look for missed opportunities, try to get our arms around the work that we're doing and the overall promises, because that is really what ceasefire is all about, is keeping our promises. We have regular check-ins. We do weekly scoring meetings. We stole that from Jacksonville. I'll give a footnote as well as my colleague from Chicago. We already thanked them profusely today and do it all the time. We continually try to tweak. We have then, that's on Wednesday at noon, and we heard it went well in our absence yesterday. And then today, just finished our weekly enforcement coordination. That's where all 3 local, state, and federal enforcement come together. It's a little bit high level of discussion, take the scores, and try to figure out strategy. Moving on, support and outreach, attend those meetings as well. I want to continue to underscore how important it is that we coordinate and communicate at every step of the way, and that, as I say to my team all the time, there should be no daylight, and we should constantly be sharing information. Intelligence is huge. We treat a non-cooperative victim just like the next shooter, so we constantly try to get our arms around it, retaliation and intelligence. Our research partner is at the foundation of it all. They do incredible work for us and have been with us since jump. It's Michigan State University, which is a huge thing for me to say because I went to the other school in the state. So go blue. And so that's huge. I acknowledge it all the time. Like, I cannot believe that we are such huge partners, and I give you kudos everywhere. But Michigan State comes through with us. It comes through for us in huge ways. They provide a social network analysis pretty much for any group scored shooting, fatal or non. They'll try to do a link analysis, figure out the major players. Recently, they just did a street segment analysis, so not only are we doing offender-based enforcement, but we're also doing place-based, particularly with the precincts on the west side that just came on and had limited intelligence, really focusing on those street segments, and it's less than 10% of the street segments in those west side precincts, we did those first, that have the highest majority of shootings. Particularly, there's 2% of the street segments have had 10 plus or more shootings, and Michigan State just finished that research for us on the west side. So really focusing on place-based, offender-based, trying to get our arms around where these groups and these crews are perpetuating the violence and driving up. Our outreach also focuses on these target areas, and as I said, the research partner is there every step of the way, and our work in schools as well is focused in those areas. So this is what it looks like for the last year. I'm going to walk you through some of the challenges. So generally, it's calendar year that we look at. Last calendar year, I want to say the two precincts that have been running ceasefire for the longest had a 26% reduction in fatal and non-fatal shootings, which is huge. Confetti drop, it certainly was the lead of our year-end crime stats. The chief was thrilled. And then January, we got shit knocked out of us. And then February wasn't looking so good either. So we got called into a lot of meetings to say, what are you guys doing? What are you focused on? And the fact of the matter is we weren't that focused. We were spreading warm margarine all over the city. And just as Chris said, unfortunately, we did have an officer-involved shooting, and it was group-related. And that changed everything. And so now we don't only have about a handful of groups that we're trying to get our arms around. We've got about 10 or 11. And there's just no way you can keep focus on that. And we were all over the city. And so we had to take a serious look and figure out what we were going to do. One of the things that we did was we instituted ceasefire ComStat. So we do a quarterly ComStat. We have a weekly ComStat in the department, like most departments do. But our assistant chief at the time, who we reported up through, said, I only want a ceasefire ComStat. We ended up rolling over 2 weeks because there was so much to do. The chief led it. The chief is a strong believer in ceasefire. He'd done ceasefire in Cincinnati. He knew that it was a tool that could work. So he led ceasefire 2 weeks in a row, and we drilled down in our 5 precincts and gang intel and looked at what is your group-focused enforcement. And as Chris said, we didn't talk about good police work because that happens every ComStat. We talked about group-focused activities. We looked at 3 measurements, just trying to peel out some of the subjective levers that are pulled on a regular basis. We looked at weapons seized, total arrest, and MDOC compliance checks, trying to get arms around that. We're probably going to shift that in the second quarter because we had a little pushback that they want different measurements, but we'll adjust as needed. But quarterly ComStat's here to stay. The chiefs feel strongly in it. And as you see, it's our favorite chart, actually. And I think it's the 8th precinct there, Sergeant. I chose yours because it's my favorite. So take a look at the first quarter, and as you see, as our fatal and non-fatal shootings were outpacing our group enforcement. And taking a look, working with the commander, the captain, and the sergeant over the gang enforcement, taking a look and shifting that focus and trying to get our arms around who's driving up the violence and focused the activities on there, and there was a dramatic reduction in the shootings. So as the first chart shows that we only had 6% in the last year, that June to June, of all 5 precincts. Hopefully the next 6 months, given the reset and given our focused attention, excuse me, oh great, I'm trashing the joint, by the way, I'm never going to invite it back, will result in the next 6 months being positive. Then also customer notification, just as Chris said, it is not a customer notification unless all three, prevention, intervention, and enforcement, go together. If it's just enforcement, and sometimes that happens in a hospital room in the moment, that's called an intervention, investigative intervention. Thank you, sir. And so customer notifications were absolutely part of CompStat and will stay part of CompStat. Our chief is a strong believer, and you've got to have it all together. You can't just arrest our way out of the problem. If you could, we'd just build bigger jails and we'd all be in really safe communities, but that unfortunately just doesn't happen. So our chief is very focused on our activities, our law enforcement activities, working with our partners in the service community as well. So we measure that. We do about 5 or 6 call-ins. We're not as, we don't have the capacity as Chicago does just quite yet. Maybe we won't get there, but we have about 5 to 6 call-ins a year. That's what we're on track for this year. And so we measure on who our participants are accepting services. We're at about a 20% participation with participants, and they turn into clients then, and who takes services. And trying to take a deeper look at data as well. Again, with Michigan State University, we have a 33.3% recidivism rate, and trying to look, that's everybody who's ever come to a call-in since 2013, trying to take a look at who those folks are. 85% of them are non-gun crimes, and trying to wrap our arms around how they can get connected to services and what services are really meaningful. And so we found that obviously basic needs, housing, transportation, education, food, if we can solve one of those, and if we can be a bridge and connect to one of those, it's much more likely that then folks will stay engaged and the clients will stay engaged in services, and we will all be successful towards our goals. And then we also found something interesting, which surprised us. It did not didn't surprise our service providers, but the highest level of contact that a participant has with the police, the more likely they are to participate in services. So they know they're hot, they know they're on the radar, they know their consequences to their actions, and it all just reinforces our partnership even more, that law enforcement has to be talking to our service providers and our support and outreach, because we're all in this together, and the participants know it. They know if they're on law enforcement radar that they should also be on the service provider's radar as well, and that's how we treat it. And last, if for anybody who knows me, and if you don't, you will know, I never talk without talking about money. It's all about the money. So in addition to the city resources that support ceasefire, they provide the administratives and sworn leadership salaries. We have dedicated ceasefire vehicles. They were delivered today, by the way. I just got word in the day I miss our strategy session, his fleet came and delivered the cars. Got brand new gang enforcement cars, and so
that was intentional.
Thank you.
Somebody
That's
else.
how I feel. That's
somebody
exactly
else
how
took
I feel.
the credit.
Thank you. They sent me out, didn't they? Yeah. So, but anyways, cars are there. That's the most important thing. Let's stay focused. So the city provides resources, and then we leverage those with our DOJ allocations. We've received 3 DOJ allocations for youth violence prevention, ceasefire, and then we just got an additional allocation that will begin here hopefully this summer. And so we leverage that with private dollars as well. We really are trying to find service gaps. We just started a contract with Lyft, and we're testing that out. It's a hometown Detroit GM product, so we're very proud about that. And so we've got a contract with Lyft to provide services, because not only are bus passes and bus tickets, as we've heard already this morning, a sustainable option, it's not always a safe option for these folks either. So really trying to provide transportation, because that is a basic need, particularly connecting opportunities and pathways, literally and figuratively. Also, we just increased our capacity for mental health services, because we need to be a wraparound full provider, not only of physical health and education, but also mental health. And so we're leveraging private dollars, and we're getting ready for the shift of what it appears to be that DOJ and the administration is moving towards, which is focus on enforcement only. So we're trying to ensure that we have support and have foundation dollars that will be able for us to continue our support and outreach work. And I'm going to end on money.
Thank you, Trisha. Vaughn?
Yeah.
The driver.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's 3 p.m. I appreciate that everyone's still here and trying to stay engaged. I'm Vaughn Crandall from the California Partnership for Safe Communities, and we work with just a couple of cities in California over a number of years to sort of go deep and help them engineer long-term successful violence reduction strategies. And what I'm going to talk about just really, I think, will build well on what Chris and Trisha talked about, which is how we try to take lessons in performance management and apply them to partnership-based work to reduce violence. And so I guess what I would ask from folks for the next 10 minutes or so that I have the floor is sort of set the ceasefire label to the side and just let's talk about how you manage a partnership to do its best work together, given that what we're trying to do is reduce violence, which is difficult, complicated, and high stakes. So in order to do that, I'm going to first, I'm sort of going to use Oakland as a case study, but I'll make a couple of references to Stockton as well. And I just want to set a little bit of Oakland context, and then I want to talk about the mechanics of the performance management, we'll call it a system that we've developed to understand violence, to organize a set of community and justice system partners around responding to that violence in the near term, and then around holding each other accountable for progress towards annual reduction goals. So just real quick, some context on Oakland. As most folks are aware, it's had a very difficult violence problem for a really long time. You know, the murder rate's been 4 to 6 times the national average and has historically been the most violent city in California. Has made major public investments in violence prevention until about the last 5 years or so with limited success. And generally has not been able to successfully sustain reductions in violence. This is the homicide trend line since the late 60s. And as you will notice, other than the one period of time between the early 90s and the late 90s, that is the only period of time where Oakland sustained multiple years under 90 homicides a year in a city of 400,000 people. And that's just the murder rate versus California. So I think the other piece that's important here when we're talking about partnership work, and this was everything that folks are talking about this morning, is the difficult history of police-community relations in Oakland. I think, and just to name it really, which is the long history of police brutality towards communities of color in Oakland. I mean, Oakland is the birthplace of the Black Panthers, and that is, in large part a response to police violence. More recently, in the 90s, there was a nationally covered corruption and brutality case known as the Riders case that resulted in a negotiated settlement agreement, a lawsuit which is still in place today. Okay, Oakland remains under that legal agreement. 2004, 4 OPD officers were murdered in the same day by a man who was on parole at large. In some circles, he was celebrated as a resistance fighter. And then more recently, and this will be covered in the documentary The Force, which screens right after this, there was a sex scandal involving an underage sex worker, which resulted in the resignation of the chief and the turnover of the command staff. And that occurs right in the context of the discussions about Ferguson and Baltimore. And so I think I raise these things because, like many cities, like Chicago, like Detroit, severe local crises are regular and frequent in Oakland. It is how things are. And so the question is, how do you sustain violence reduction work, partnership-based work between police and community over time, given that these things will happen, right? So what do you do with that? So I'll give you guys our best guess so far. So I think one thing that's really important is that for us, what we found is to do partnership work, it's really important to have clarity on your goals in the context of the partnership. And so, especially in a city like Oakland, police and community disagree on a lot of things. But there's a couple of things that a critical mass of stakeholders do agree on, which is, one is people want to reduce violence. They don't want more young men to be shot or killed in the city of Oakland. They want to do it in a way that doesn't increase the footprint of the justice system and really would like it to do it in a way that there's less incarceration. And they all see that it's necessary to build trust between police and community in order to do those first two things. And so we see these things as interconnected, and very early on in the ceasefire work in Oakland, people said, we need to make these goals explicit, because really it's not, we don't just want to reduce violence, there's a way we want to do it, and our violence reduction works needs to be consistent with a goal of reducing the system. Oh, no, it's okay, sorry.
No, I'll drive this.
Oh, sorry, no, I got it.
You sure?
Yeah. Thank you.
Keep me awake.
Sorry, I'm looking at my computer. I'm not looking at the slideshow. Thank you for that.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, so I talked about
There
that.
we go.
Yeah, so here we go. Okay, so we want to do it in a way that's consistent with our values. So we want to do it in a way that shrinks the use of incarceration and builds police community trust. And that is really, that's a triple bottom line we like to refer to, right? That it's not just violence reduction, but we want to also be managing towards these things as well. And so why is performance management important in the context of a discussion about sustainability? And I think one thing is, a lot of what we're trying to do is change the way these public systems work, right? And you really can't manage what you don't measure. I mean, that was sort of the insight behind CompStat, right? And so in the context of the partnership, though, as someone who works as like a third party with cities, a difficult experience we often have is we have an understanding of where we think folks should go, but they're not on the same page between each other about what is good work. Or in one way, what is ceasefire? And are we doing it or are we not doing it? And are we doing the best version of it or a less good version of it? And so I think part of the importance inside of performance management is creating a set of indicators that everybody understands and that are transparent and everyone is fluent about the actual mechanics of the strategy that they're using so that there can be mutual accountability. And I think what this creates a table where community and city leaders can sit at a table together and say, one is, how are we doing on shootings and homicides? Like, let's be clear about what our outcomes are. And then, are we doing the activities that we've agreed to are the strategy that we're using to achieve those outcomes? And if we're not doing those things, why not? Are people not doing their jobs? Do we have a resource problem? Has some other barrier come up that we need to solve? But I think the trap that people can get in sometimes, and by people I mean TA providers, is that we don't have any power or leverage, right? The power and leverage in a city is for city and community folks to hold each other accountable for a different kind of work. And so that's why I think performance management is so important. So just a brief overview of the system sort of as it exists now. So it's really a 3-part series of meetings. The first one is the shooting review in the police department, which identifies very highest risk people, hottest conflicts, and sort of enforcement priorities. This is pretty similar to what Chris was talking about earlier. The second is what we call a coordination meeting, where that analysis of violence in the city for this particular week is carried into a conversation with the folks who lead and coordinate outreach, hospital and crisis response, life coaching, and an array of CBO contractors to say, okay, if this is the police department's sense of violence in the city as it exists now, what community tools and strategies can we bring to bear on that dynamic, right? And then every other month, there is a larger performance review meeting where a set of stakeholders at the executive level, the mayor, agency heads, community leaders, sit down and say, over this 2-month period, what do our shooting trends look like? How do we do on the key activities that we use to define our work? And what do we need to do better? And in the context of that, we have set 2-month and annual benchmarks that make sure we're tracking a reduction in that year that we've set as a goal for ourselves. So in a second, this will make a little more sense because I'll make it concrete. So just quickly in the shooting review, just to give a little bit more detail, and just as a plug, anybody who's interested in this, Reagan Harmon and Captain Ursi Joyner will talk in more detail about this tomorrow. It's convened by the chief, it's run by Captain Joyner, and it's a cross-section of the department. And essentially, it's like Chris was outlining, they review deliverables, they look at all shootings in the city over the prior week, fatals, non-fatals, non-injuries, right? Every incidence of gunfire that was recorded, and say, given this, what is the current dynamic in the city that we need to pay attention to? And so with that understanding, they say, okay, we have a strategy in place now. Does our current strategy hold, given the 10 shootings we had this week? Do we need to modify it? Do we need a whole new strategy, right? And then based on that, they say, okay, and who do we need help from, right? Probation, parole, the DA, federal partners, and outreach, our community partners, our faith partners, life coaches, hospital response. And then that initial sense of it, again, moves into the coordination meeting. So the shooting review happens every week, every other week. The ceasefire director and one representative of the police department then sit down with the leaders of Oakland Unite and community partners and look at these shootings together and the PD's assessment of risk. And they say, again, what people and networks are at the greatest risk of imminent violence in the near future, and what are we going to do about it? And so the people who are under active investigation and imminent risk of arrest are not brought into that meeting, right? Those, they've been identified, enforcement action will be taken on them, they are kept out of that. But that is generally a very small number of people in this highest risk category. And so then the conversation becomes, what are all the other things that we can do to help to try to reduce the risk that these guys are involved in violence in the next couple of weeks, given that we know they're probably the highest risk in the city right now. So is that custom notifications? Is that hospital response? Is that family support for victims' families? Is that life coaches reaching out and giving extra touches to guys who they're already working with but are affected by this current dynamic? Is that violence interruption or conflict mediation? Is that in-reach into the local jail or to the prison system? Is that certain attention from street outreach, et cetera? And then in the last year, what we started to do is have a conversation about a small number of people who have remained in this sort of highest risk category, by which we mean they continually come up as victims, potential suspects, or people who are connected to shootings, and we have not successfully moved them out of that highest risk category. And so then we have a kind of a particular strategy conversation about them. What more can we do around these guys who we've been trying to help get out of life for 2 or 3 years and we're just not succeeding? And so then we do a number of things around just general coordination. Are we respecting boundaries? Is the information flow healthy? Are there client concerns about the way they're being treated by officers or the justice system that we need to try to address in this room, et cetera? And that leads to this larger performance review meeting, again, which is sort of at the city and community executive level, convened by the mayor, attended by agency heads, the chief of the police department, the head of human services, the head of Oakland Unite, community partners, and our organization, the partnership. And what we do is we assemble this set of outcome activity indicators that tracks our progress towards these bi-month and annual benchmarks. And so essentially together as a group, we sit down and we look at our outcomes, shooting trends, relative to our benchmarks. Are we making progress in this 2-month period towards an annual reduction of at least 10% in fatal and non-fatal shootings? We want to exceed that. We want to far exceed that. But at a minimum, we want to be hitting a 10% reduction, right? And then we look at our activity indicators, direct communication, outreach and support, focused person-specific enforcement informed by procedural justice, and coordination. And we have a running conversation about what's needed. Where are we falling down? What are our indicators telling us? And so this is what that looks like. This is the outcome sheet that folks look at. In 2017, our benchmark, the minimum threshold of homicides that we want to come under is 72, and that would represent a 10% reduction. And similarly, non-fatal.
Your laptop isn't syncing to
Sorry.
the big
Well,
one,
yeah, 'cause I'm
so
not-
just so they can see
I'm
the
not following it.
outcomes.
Okay, you guys got to
There you
kick
go.
me if that happens again.
Let me drive it.
No, it's okay.
Now you're like this at home too?
Yeah, I am.
That's
Okay.
ridiculous. I'm a good
So,
driver.
okay, it's okay. So here's our outcome
All right,
indicators.
I'm kicking in next
Yeah. So this is our fatal and non-fatal shooting outcome indicator sheet. And so what you see is in 2017, we have a set benchmark of 72 that we want to meet or exceed, and we come in under 307 non-fatal shootings, right? And so then we say, given over the last 2 months, where are we, right? Are we hitting that? Are we meeting that, exceeding it? In this particular time period, we didn't meet the homicide benchmark, but we met the non-fatal shooting benchmark. Then we come over here and say, okay, if that's the case, are we hitting our direct communication benchmarks, which again, we've tacked to our problem analysis and our shooting reviews so that we have a pretty good working estimate of how much direct communication we need to do over the course of a year, how much outreach and support uptake we think we can get given our direct communication target, right? The capacities in the police department that need to be fully staffed and focused in order for us to do a couple of enforcement operations a year, and that's what we do, is just a couple. And then again, are we well coordinated? Do we have the key managers from across these agencies and the community meeting on a regular basis to develop a joint strategy? And again, what we find is, generally, if we hit our benchmarks on a 2-month basis, shootings go down, right? They will meet or exceed our identified benchmark. And if we don't hit our communication benchmarks, if we're not doing enough communication, or if something's happened that's a barrier to our outreach and support work, or if something's happened that's affected the ability of the PD folks to work, then shootings go up. And so it's a very useful way, again, to create fluency and mutual accountability between community leaders and city leaders around what is the work that we have agreed to do together, and are we doing it now? Okay, so I apologize for not tracking the PowerPoint better, because you guys, this has been so crystal clear. But anyway, so here's how we're doing so far. This is, again, the long-term homicide trend line. And these are shooting trends in Oakland since 2012, which was the start of the current partnership-based effort. And basically, I think what it shows is steady progress towards what we really want, which is safe city status, right? And again, every year, sort of to your point about Detroit, every quarter is a struggle. But I think, again, if we can keep partners focused in each 2-month period, that helps us build towards a year of reductions, which puts us in a place to do good work in another 2 months, 2 months, and another year. And I think that's what keeps folks focused over time. So just to say this, to our point about goals and values, right, I think ceasefire is neither responsible for the number of arrests nor for the decline. But I think that actually has to do with larger trends having to do with the recession in California and staffing levels. But I think the important thing is, if you look at this, and this is farther down now if you updated it, the OPD is making 30% as many arrests as it made 10 years ago. And complaints and uses of force are each also down by over 50%. And so the fact is, you can get a 40% reduction in fatal and non-fatal shootings while your footprint is going down. And I think this speaks to the point of what are your values that hold the partnership together. And I think this is what can help community partners stay at the table, and community partners want to hold a police department accountable to that. We want greater safety with less incarceration, and we need to know that that's actually happening, not just that you're telling us that it's happening. This is just our recidivism rate. Folks have talked about that before. So I've covered this. I think all I'll say in closing to lift it up is, I think the conclusion that we've come to is, this stuff doesn't work if you don't have a critical mass of senior managers who are effective in their lanes. So that's police department, that's outreach and intervention, and that's sort of community organizing. And I think you need a unifying management framework where each one of those constellations of people understands what the work is, what their performance is going to be measured by, right? And how that is going to likely influence your outcomes, your shooting outcomes. And so, again, this is a work in progress, but I think just our experience so far is that it's worth doing. So I'll close with that.
Okay, we're going to go to Louisa, and then when she completes, we're going to open the floor for questions.
Okay, and I'm actually going to stand up because I can't see this. So the good news is I really will be quick, because between Vaughn, Trisha, and Chris, they've, number one, stolen most of my talking points, and number two, have spoken more concretely to a lot of the stuff than I'm going to be able to. But very briefly, a lot of folks in the room know the National Network, know our work, are working with us on implementing the group violence intervention specifically. Those of you I work with directly, you're getting points for being here. You can tell your compatriots who are not in the room that they are on my list. But I'm gonna take advantage of my sort of bird's eye perch here and be really general again, because between these three cities, if you're not already convinced that there's a way to sustain this stuff through basically any crisis, scandal, transition that could buffet an intervention and come out the other side with it still moving, then we've got nothing else to teach you, because if these folks can, have built something that can sustain the work in their cities, then anybody can. I'm going to go really quickly here. These are some of the core elements that folks will be familiar with when the National Network talks about sustainability and project management and accountability, right? Depends on a range of partners. Executive leadership is really important. And we are really didactic about the need for a specific person to be empowered to steer this ship. And everyone's heard that. That's probably not surprising, and hopefully it's pretty intuitive to folks. Here's where we are now, implementing currently with about 25 cities, having worked in the past and with a lot more. These things just get truer. Executive leadership is absolutely irreplaceable, and I think you guys have heard from Vaughn, from Trisha, from Chris. They've mentioned the chiefs in this meeting. The mayor's, cares about the statistics. The mayor runs our bi-monthly performance reviews. That level of actual tangible investment from executive leadership is irreplaceable in this work. Project managers are not only important, turns out they're critical. What Chris and Trisha didn't mention is that they are actually the architects of these management systems in their cities. And you've now heard them speak. You have a sense, I hope, of the position that they occupy, what they've been charged with, what their portfolios contain, and the extent to which they've been empowered by the executive partners in their cities to drive this stuff day to day. The project manager is usually the only person in the city for whom this stuff is the #1 priority all the time. Yeah. Everybody else, the chief, there's a homicide with the district attorney, there's a really high priority case, right? For the head of the local Goodwill, there's something coming up that's going to be your edge this out for a minute on a day, right? The project manager is the person for whom steering this ship is the single most important thing all the time. And that perspective and that empowerment turns out critically important to sustaining this stuff. Project managers have different backgrounds and strengths and skill sets. We work with folks who are former law enforcement, former outreach workers, former support and outreach. They all have the same role and the same charge, and a lot of our thinking has been about how do we empower them to work with their cities to own this stuff so that we don't fall into, or we can get ourselves out of the trap that Vaughn mentioned earlier as TA providers of making ourselves indispensable, right? We want to get out and have our city partners own and sustain this stuff far beyond their formal partnership with us. So there's a few persistent challenges that derail this work day to day, right? It's hard to maintain focus. So it's not that the work is hard. So it's not that the inherent strategy is so challenging that folks kind of can't keep it in their heads. It's maintaining focus is hard. Mission creep is something the cities I talk with, you guys know we talk about this all the time, right? There's a tendency to go upstream and get bigger than we need to be about what is ultimately a really small problem involving a small number of people. And there are 10,000 other things. There's, Vaughn mentioned again, there's the scandal of the week, there's a budget cut, there's any number of other things that can distract the core partners from the work itself day to day. Relationships are hard to manage, right? There are a lot of partners at the table when we do this work. It's a little like herding cats, right? Everyone's got their own relationships that they need to manage separate from this strategy, and that can sometimes run counter to what this strategy is trying to get done. And there's also a reality of chain of command, and it's not just for law enforcement, right? Everybody's got a boss, and everyone knows what I want them to do when I'm on the phone with them once a week as your TA provider, and then there's what your boss wants you to do. So finding ways to isolate that to the extent we can from those day-to-day chain of command and relationship management issues turns out to be really important. And then collaborative problem solving is where it's at, right? And it's a lot easier said than done, and if nothing else, you need space to do it, you need time to do it, you need someone to convene people, and you need folks to feel accountable to each other, and none of that is easy. So things that we think we've learned from sites like these three, and this is going to echo a lot of what Vaughn said, and I'm just going to generalize it a little bit more so that hopefully everybody in the room feels like they're walking out with something that feels applicable to their city. So shared mission, clearly stated, helps prevent mission creep. And Detroit and Oakland thoughtfully included what felt, at least to me, and folks speak up if I got that wrong, something like a mission statement in their presentations today, right? Detroit has reduced shootings, creating job opportunities, change community norms. It's not stop crime in the city. It's not fix our educational system. It's not make sure every kid in the community has a mentor. Oakland's saying reduce shootings and homicides, decrease recidivism, strengthen police-community relations. If you're doing this work, odds are this stuff is percolating in the back of your head already. It doesn't have to be called a mission statement, but making sure all of your partners are on the same page about what it is we're actually trying to do in the context of our group violence intervention, and a lot of this I think can be extrapolated to our intimate partner violence intervention, our drug market work, right? It's not the universe, it's actually a pretty small problem. Clear governance structure, so folks talked about that. This is something as simple as who's reporting to who and who's around the table, and just being really clear about that. Mm-hmm. Executive leadership, as I mentioned, is critically important. Turns out about 2/3 of the cities that we're working with right now have some kind of executive board or governance committee that's meeting regularly, and that's usually folks like the mayor and the chief and the district attorney and some of the key community stakeholders. So that's awesome. Thumbs up to you all if you're already doing that, but it doesn't have to necessarily be that tangible, but we've learned it's irreplaceable. someone in a project manager role who's empowered to do all of this stuff and to keep the ship moving day to day and to manage up when necessary and to manage down and across to the operational folks who are actually getting the work done. So turns out putting this on paper and making clear to folks that here's who's at the table, here's how we're all going to work together, does need to be sort of said explicitly. Otherwise, what happens is we end up asking good people to get a lot done based on their personal relationships. And folks get burned out, and that's totally understandable because chain of command is real and relationship management is real, and to the extent we can protect those things from feeling arbitrary by putting them on paper and making them formal, we've learned that we should do that. We also need some sort of diagnostic and planning tool to know what we're doing, and that's really the meat of what Chris and Trisha and Vaughn laid out. I think you saw 3 great examples of what diagnostic and planning tools look like. Those could be crime trends, they could be metric sheets, they could be a clear kind of matrix of here are our goals, here's what we're going to be looking at to see if we're meeting those goals. We have thoughtfully put together something like this that if you are working with us and you haven't seen this already, you will be seeing it very soon. This is something, and folks probably can't see it that well, so I'll click through it quickly. This is something the National Network is calling just our implementation review. And what we attempted to do is basically build out about 6 sheets worth of Excel charts asking yes or no questions, right? Does your city have a governance committee? If you don't, doesn't necessarily mean you're doing it wrong. You might be doing something else in the place of a governance committee that's getting you to the same spot, so that might be okay. If you have it, who's on it? Are folks engaged in meeting regularly? It's basically a diagnostic. It's meant to help us as strategic advisors and our city partners who are on the ground take stock in a sort of neutral way of what are the moving pieces here, and are there gaps we didn't know were gaps, and are there opportunities that we haven't been taking advantage of. And this should incorporate some sort of goal setting. So here we've got, quickly, this is governance, right? You have the right stakeholders in place. Are they talking to each other? Is the project manager in place and responsible for keeping these folks informed? When it comes to law enforcement, are you doing regular group and gang audits? Do you know who's driving the violence in your city? Who's in the room for those? Again, any of these, the answer could be no, and it couldn't mean anything back, right? It might just mean, actually, our SROs shouldn't be in our group audit for this reason, and that might be okay. But this is a good way of getting everyone kind of on the same page. So we built this out for as Chris mentioned, all 3 buckets of GDI, focused deterrence work, law enforcement, community partnerships, and support and outreach. And the point of this, and I can come back to this later if folks are interested, is to set clear performance and accountability expectations, right? We've done a diagnostic. The goal, actually, of this thing is that the way we're rolling it out now is the national network takes a look at this based on our relationship with the city and the work we've been doing. We ask the project manager or the city stakeholders to take a look at it also and do their own sort of diagnosis. We talk about it together and we set some planning tools. And it's meant to be a means of keeping us all on the same page and kind of communicating collectively what are our goals, what are our top priorities. So that we can then hold each other collectively, both strategic advisors and city partners among themselves, accountable for what is it we actually want to get done on what time frame and what gap is it going to fill and how's it going to help us get to our shared mission. So this is where the fact that you have a governance structure here becomes really important, because you've got your TA providers, in this case that's us, looking through this diagnostic and counseling, probably your project manager, your city, here's what we think might be gaps, opportunities, goals, priorities based on what you've laid out as what your intentions are when you implement this work. Project manager does the same thing. They're on the ground. They know what's going on in ways that strategic advisors can't, at least not us at the national network. It can't be in 22 different cities at once. Project manager is sharing that simultaneously with their executive leadership and with each of their operational working groups. And this is a feedback loop that, from our perspective, should happen probably quarterly, right? If not closer than that to real time. And I'm going to stop there.
All right, we're going to open the floor for questions. Yes.
Two-part question. So one is, for your program, it doesn't look funding at the state level. I wonder, is there any potential for that? Is that something you would even want? And how, what would that look like? And the second part of the question is, in terms of the private funding, what's been successful for reaching out and getting the private investment, or what are some of the lessons learned when you've not been successful with those efforts?
Interesting. I don't think when you asked them they're going to link together. State funding, we've started to talk a little bit about doing line item appropriations. It's good and bad, right? Because you got to then go fight for it every year. The state just came in during bankruptcy and certainly was a huge player in, exactly, so this is how it's all going to come together, is a huge player in ensuring that our bankruptcy was able to be tidied up and finalized and work out a grand bargain is what it was called. And in doing so, they pulled together the private foundations, and there was 6 of them that led the effort, and a few more, but some of the real big players in town that have the private dollars. So everybody was in it together. Never waste a good crisis, right? In towards that end, while everybody is skin in the game, then we were able to talk about some of the key priorities of the mayor and of the chief, which is violence prevention is huge. So that's part of why we don't have state money right now, because they just gave in a big way from a negotiated settlement to settle the bankruptcy, and then also how the foundations came in. Now, of course, there's an ebb and a flow to those relationships, and we're still having those conversations to begin to leverage. And there's a reason why I put the slide up. There's a reason why I look at that slide all the time in my head, in my office, is that we're constantly looking for ways to connect the dollars and to sustain what we do. We're applying to some new national foundations that we've never done before, so we're trying to broaden that out. Again, really preparing for what we feel is going to be a pretty strong shift from DOJ, and they're going to focus on strict enforcement dollars, and we really need to sustain the other half. So we'll probably go back to the state now that they're not sick of seeing us just quite yet, and try to get a line item appropriation. That'll probably be the best way to do it.
Yes, sir.
So this is a question for both of y'all about the notifications. So you deal with more organizations, not cliques in Chicago, right?
What do you mean by organizations? On the street?
Yeah, on the streets.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Custom notification.
yeah, the customs are designed to speak to individuals, but to address the group accountability. So whether they're a clique, a crew, a faction, a block, a squad, whatever they decide to call themselves, but it's the groups. So we talk to the groups through the individual.
So my question is, when you said it works better with law enforcement, social service, and the community, and then you said you have a mother that goes as well, what makes her so special with certain individuals that still have issues with people coming to their house?
Yeah. Well, I think 2 things. First, it's unique in that you're at their domicile, you're at their residence, right? They're used to talking to you on the street, on the corner, in the park, wherever. You're actually at the place where they lay their head. What makes it more effective, I think, is because, I tell, and for you Detroit folks and all the Michigan folks, I'm going to quote Woody Hayes. You win with people. I say that all the time. You win with people. And I think that when you have people, a lot of times in this work, we look for people who resonate with us, but we don't look for the people who resonate with the guys that we're working with. And that, I think, is really part of the key. When the mom who lost her son to violence is talking to a guy who's engaged in behaviors that may have cost her son his life, or her son was involved in those same behaviors, it's a whole different flow. You can physically see on the door-to-door custom notifications a change in body language and a change in effect in how they talk, and when you shift from the law enforcement messaging to the community messaging. But I think that that's the key, is that it's the messenger a lot of times, because everyone understands the message. People aren't dumb. They know what they're doing is not safe. They know what they're doing is not good for the community, and sometimes it's, sometimes it's who's the person to convey the message.
So you guys think it's definitely better with all 3 instead of just individual?
For the purposes of this, I think so. I mean, we have data that shows it's impactful. We've been doing it we've been doing it just law enforcement, we've been doing it just street outreach, and we've been doing it just social services. And from what I've seen over the last 10 years, this is much more effective. And at the end of the day, I want to win. I don't want to go through the motions. And, this is so important. We're talking about human lives here.
I just want to follow up quick because, of course, I got to quote Bo Schembechler and protect my university and my state. So it's the team. That's what Bo Schembechler is famous for, and lots of other things. But we are all in this together. So that's why we feel strongly that we have to be there all together. And so it's law enforcement, it's the faith-based, it's the service providers to say, law enforcement goes first, you're on our radar screen. And that's not a good thing. But let me introduce you to my friends here because they want you to be on their radar screen. And as my good friend Keith's been in the room quotes all the time, we're recruiting you. We want you to be on our team. Don't be on law enforcement's team because those consequences are good.
How long did it take to build that relationship?
Well, we're still building it. We work on it all the time, but when we look to find gaps in services, we look to increase capacity all the time. But we've been doing this collective team right here for almost 2 years.
Yeah. Essentially, what we tell people is, you're going to have 3 to 4 minutes to save a life. What are you going to do in those 3 to 4 minutes? You cannot afford to be in somebody else's lane. Another question?
It's funny that you're saying this. I wanted to know more about that too. I'm from Pittsburgh and GBI coordinator for Pittsburgh. My question is, are you taking the mother to the house and the hospital? And if you are taking the mother to the house and the hospital, is there some type of training that you provide for her? Because I know the police and us as GBI coordinators know how to deal with that.
Right.
A lot of times the mothers are emotional, and we don't want them to trigger something.
So we're not, to clear, our normal rule of thumb is a year after the death of your loved one. That's the normal rule. Now, we violated that rule. It depends on the individual. For some of our moms, and Maria could talk more about this. Maria, could you raise your hand, stand up? So Maria is one of the moms that goes out with us. She could talk more if anybody has any specific questions for her afterwards. But it's for, this stuff is healing for everybody, because people don't hear. We talk about this stuff, but we don't have real conversations about this. We don't delve into truth with this. So one of the reasons I started this stuff off and said no P's was the rule. No preachers, no politicians, and no press. And the reason that I said that, we violate that. We have a couple preachers with us right now who go out with us. But the reason I say that out the gate is because we can't afford for anyone to usurp the message. The message is the thing, because the community owns this thing. This isn't the police department's proprietary or the outreach people's. It's everybody owns this thing collectively. So it really becomes a process where the community kind of heals itself as you go through, and then you start to see those changes as you go through with consistency. But we do trainings. We've been undermined. We've done a training and then had another organization tell the group of moms, if you go out with them, we actually lost a year, I think it was, David. We lost a year in getting on the street with the moms because right after we did the training with a group of moms to go out and do this outreach with us, another group came behind us, called the moms together in a room and said, they're trying to make you all police informants. They're going to take all the information that you give and they're going to give it to the police and they're going to get these black men all locked up. So the moms just kind of shut down. And then there was a couple moms, Maria was one of them, who said, you know what, forget the larger group. Just start out, with who you have right now and we'll figure it out. But it cost us a year. I think Isaac or someone's talking about social service gangbanging. It cost us, how many lives could we have potentially saved in a year? And as you know, the more you do this, I tell people, we're the best in the country at this. Well, we've crashed the plane so many daggone times. We've done 82 call-ins and 2,500 custom notification attempts in the last 4 or 5 years. So, you get better as you go. How much better could we be right now if we had another year under our belt doing it? I think we have time for one more question.
Isaac, can I stop there? I wanted to talk about the sustainability and accountability when you have turnover within the police department and also within political office as the mayor's office. How do you maintain that stability and also the credibility with the community?
Vaughn, you want to take that one?
Sure. I know this doesn't work for everybody, but I would definitely say in California that having partners who are community organizers really helps. or anybody who is willing to do community organizing. I think that's really where what can hold a city to this over time, because the mayor is going to leave at some point, the chief is going to leave at some point. Unfortunately, in Oakland, that's happened a lot at the department level. But I think I sort of, just to give, I think, credit where it is due. In Oakland, OCO, which is a local organizing group, organized around bringing ceasefire to Oakland for 10 years, more than that, at least 10 years. And every time that a chief has resigned or been fired, they have been ready to go meet with the mayor, meet with the council, and meet with the new chief and say, we demand, because we're the ones who are losing and burying sons, that you continue to do this work. And I think what that allows is the people who have already been doing it to say, okay, we can keep working. And it's not that you don't, there are always costs with transitions, right? There are also often opportunities. But I think having somebody who's outside of the city who has become fluent in how to advocate for this or whatever policy, whatever local policy that they want, and understands how to use that power with decision makers is helpful.
If I can just add one thing to that quickly, I think another way to think about that's maybe more granular, but sort of immediate is, and for folks who are in Deanna Hoskins's talk earlier on support and outreach, so she applied this to support and outreach, but it applies to the work as a whole as well as make it policy, right? Formalize it, right? Where Vaughn already plugged shooting reviews, so for folks who have heard a little bit about that and are intrigued, make sure to go to that panel tomorrow. If you've got a fantastic meeting that's being coordinated by a great person and it's not in their job description, put it in their job description, right? Mm-hmm. The captain of gang intelligence shall forthwith convene a weekly shooting review and build it in. And those are things that we're learning as we see these innovations cropping up in sites and these advances in project management. They feel really good, and they're things that we ought to be able to formalize. And that doesn't guarantee anything, right? Folks are sort of kings of their domain in some ways in different positions. It doesn't mean someone won't come in and want to do something differently, but if it's working and it's worth doing, and you've got folks in the room consistently saying, yeah, this is working for us, we should be formalizing that, and then we will be stealing it and sending it to other cities and saying, this is the write-up of how South Bend does their shooting review, or how, right, and these three folks can all attest to the fact that everything they've shared here, I think we're able to now share out with everyone else because they've written it down.
Could I piggyback on that real quick? I totally agree, and I think there's two things in there that are really important. And one is, I think that in policy, if you're going to reduce violence, then you need to focus your public and community efforts on people who are at highest risk of violence. And I think what happens a lot of times is in transitions, and generally with this mission creep thing, which is a fact, you're always renegotiating who we're working with and to what end. And so all of a sudden, you have outreach workers who are doing hospital response who are in junior high schools, right? And so I think one thing about, I think it can be helpful in local policy to say we are going to use some kind of analysis of gun violence to guide who we work with, right? And then I think the other thing is, to the extent that you find governance structures that work, I totally agree. If you got an executive, like a city or a county executive who is on your team, just put it in a policy document, right? Even if they've never done that before, just do it. It's more helpful to have it in writing than not. And then again, if you've got some community allies, at least when that person leaves, they have something to go to the next person and say, this is how we did it in your predecessor's hand. And so at least we have something to negotiate.
If I could just add to, because I'm Peter Kim from the City of Oakland. I work with Vaughn out in Oakland. But since we're talking about sustainability, that was a question that Isaac had raised. Something that we did in Oakland back in 2004, Measure Y, which was a piece of legislation that was passed, was actually focused specifically on reducing violence. So this was a 10-year measure that actually dedicates funds to services as well as policing efforts that are focused on violence reduction. Well, that actually was then put back on the ballot in 2014 and passed for another 10 years. So this actually generates currently about $24 million a year. Again, that gets split. $2 million goes to the fire department, 60% then goes to police, the last 40% comes to services. But my point in raising this is that Here we have a measure that lasts for 10 years, and so as you have administrations change and you have mayors come in and out, or even other high-ranking officials come in and out, this measure is actually solid and in place. This allowed us under Measure Y to create this network of support services that was in place and ready and primed, so that when ceasefire then returns to Oakland in the second iteration, we have a network of service provision that was already there, that was ready to be accessed and then be brought into the partnership, and then currently exists. So I think that's kind of the question around how do you use policy to implement sustainable work, and so we did it in Oakland. And the last thing I'll say to this is that both measures really were the product of communities coming together and pushing for this work, and actively engaging this process of affecting policy to get something on the ballot. And just as a way to show, to illustrate this, in Oakland, a special tax has to have 2/3 vote, so you need 66% of the vote, which isn't always easy to do. But City of Oakland voters knew that this was something they wanted, and Measure Z in 2014 passed with 77% of the vote. So again, this speaks, this is a testament to how if community folks mobilize and communicate with their folks in getting behind something like this, I think it can happen.
And that's a great example of having the right people, winning with people, and the right team. Trisha,
thank you.
And the team,
One more time, please.
But the team,
Thank you.
And the team put the Detroit slides in Michigan State green and white.
It's the Detroit Police Department's colors. I cannot be held accountable.
But seriously, I think the point that was made about Oakland, if you try to take this to a state rep or a state senator, what happens? It gets pork bellied, it gets this, it gets that. When the voters themselves get this measure going and get 66% of the vote and have a grassroots movement there, those are the right partners to have who can help generate that and get that done. I'll close out and just say thanks for coming. I think this was the best panel of the conference. I'll say in advance. Vaughn will do his best in the shooting review, or Reagan, the shooting review. There'll be some good ones, but there's only room for one best at the top. But this is
humble.
Yeah, but this, I will also tell you this. This is always a work in progress. All of what you see here with the slide, this comes from years of failure, falling on your face, getting something wrong, realizing, holy crap, we've sustained this through 2 mayors and 5 different police superintendents, 3 permanent and 2 interim, through a big release of event. All types of stuff has happened, like Louisa said, and we're still going. And part, I think the last thing that happened, I didn't hear from David for like a week, and he's like, you guys are still, I really thought that was the end, but we're still kicking, and part of it, you think I'm joking? He'll tell you. But part of it is you build it as you go, and you figure it out as you go. Hence the importance, and I encourage all of you in my last words, plug in the people in this national network, because that's where we go to when we're struggling with something. You have your TA advisors, but you also have your partners in other cities, because you're not seeing something that they haven't already seen or that they're not going to already see down the road. So thanks for your attendance and your appreciate your time.